It's My Nerd World, a Star Wars show, and on this week's episode, Star Wars Theory, the YouTuber, talks with the former writer for what would have been the Kenobi film before it was turned into the Obi-Wan Kenobi television series, and talks about, well, what could have been. Speaking of films, has Rey's movie been put indefinitely on hold? Plus, we have your listener feedback this week.
It's an instinct. A feeling. The Force brought us together. We're not alone. Good people will fight if we lead them.
People keep telling me they know me. No one does.
But I do.
Long have I waited. And now you're coming together. Is your undoing.
Confronting fear is the destiny of a Jedi. Your destiny. The Force will be with you.
Always.
My Nerd World.
And welcome to it, a Star Wars show, and I'm your host, Jon Justice. I'm glad you're with another episode this week. If you want to email me, TalkShowNerd@gmail.com, and if you're enjoying the show on YouTube, be sure to leave a comment there, and I'll share it on next week's episode. So my week in Star Wars has been watching Revenge of the Sith, and I'm not even 100% sure why I landed on Revenge of the Sith. It's not a film as of late that typically I sort of default to when I want to go and watch Star Wars. I've really been focusing on the sequel trilogy or some of the live-action shows, and Ahsoka specifically. But for some reason, I had the desire to sit down and watch Revenge of the Sith. And once again, another experience watching a Star Wars film that I've seen dozens and dozens of times before, and just watching the film and taking the opportunity to look beyond the focus of what we're supposed to be taking in on the screen, making sure that my phone is set aside so that I can let myself be immersed in the story, but also looking around a bit at how dense and rich the universe is. And I was wondering, while the film wrapped up, and enjoyed the experience as I often do when I revisit a Star Wars film that I've watched in a little while. And when I say that, I mean a matter of months, certainly not years. I actually let the credits roll and just sat there and thought about the film for a bit, enjoying the soundtrack. My wife is currently out of town, and with fewer individuals in the house, a little bit less privacy, I can crank up the volume more. So I was simply enjoying the John Williams score as the credits were rolling, and wondering to myself, sort of what could have been. And this is going to be a theme in the show, as a Star Wars YouTuber had the opportunity to talk with a writer, the original writer of the Kenobi movie trilogy, and I'm excited to share with you a bit of what that story would have been. But it's fairly well known, George Lucas has been very vocal about the fact that one of the reasons why he sold Star Wars and Lucasfilm to Disney was because he was just simply tired of the backlash and the heat that he got from the fans based off the sequel trilogy. And that was prior to the arrival of social networking, and that was still something that was very much pushed forward on online. And one of the reasons, not all the reasons, George was certainly getting up there, but one has to wonder what could have been if George had maintained control of Lucasfilm and what potentially he could have created. Now, he's made mention before of what his potential for a new set of films would be, and it sounded like they would have been even stranger than what George Lucas had said for other individuals have said about George Lucas and midichlorians and things of that nature. It would have been even more weird than something like midichlorians that were introduced within the prequel trilogy that people seem to have such a difficulty with. So one can never know what he would have created. I say all of that because just watching those films, they really are amazing movies. I remember one of the first times that when Revenge of the Sith first came out and talking to my father, and I remember his initial reaction, he probably doesn't even remember this, but he was like, that was an absolute masterpiece. And I typically have that response at the end of Revenge of the Sith. And while I love the sequel trilogy, they are certainly very, very different from that sequel trilogy and certainly the original trilogy as well. And I say all of this as a precursor to some of the news items I want to get into this week, not just the Kenobi film and what could have been, but also what has been speculated for a while, and we're getting further confirmation of what would have become of The Mandalorian Season 4 and this Mandalorian and Grogu film. We're just in this area in the state of flux right now, and questions about what the future of this franchise is going to be. I talked on a previous episode about the divisions that have formed in the fandom and hit just a fever pitch in the wake of the cancellation of The Acolyte, and that still continues to be a driving factor in so much of the commentary about what will come next from Lucasfilm and what Lucasfilm and Disney need to do to try to bring the magic back to Star Wars via the fandom that is absolutely and completely divided right now. And maybe all of this is inevitable, just like our social sphere is divided right up through, pop culture into politics. A lot of this driven because of the social networking that I mentioned before. So many voices being able to put their views and opinion out into the ether ends up creating fandom bubbles that drive divisions and confirmation bias as well. Has us all just wondering what happens next. And that got me, again, that's what got me thinking after watching Revenge of the Sith, and just an absolutely incredible film. And what could have been with Star Wars if George had never sold it. But alas, he did go and sell it, and here we are. So let's start off here. I've talked about this before on the show, and it's further confirmation about what The Mandalorian and Grogu film is going to be and what it means for the future of The Mandalorian itself.
This is not going to go the way you think.
So the rumor is that the Mandalorian and Grogu movie, which is right now the only film that we know for sure is slated to come out in 2026. There's questions about whether or not Rey's post-Episode 9 film may have been indefinitely canceled. Also, Taika Waititi's, that has indefinitely been put on hold as well. I'll talk more about this in a moment. But The Mandalorian and Grogu is the next movie that's going to hit the big screen. And in my mind, at least, it's a big question mark on whether or not this is going to be the hit that Lucasfilm and Disney really, really need. I'm hard-pressed to say what Disney and Lucasfilm could possibly do right now that would ensure an absolute hit. I mean, The Mandalorian and Grogu seems like the most obvious answer to capture the attention of certainly the casual Star Wars fan, but also the more hardcore Star Wars fan like you that listen to this show. That being said, having some distance from The Mandalorian live-action show, mixed success based off of Ahsoka. Don't know what's going to come of Skeleton Crew later this year, and I'm speaking specifically to the Dave Filoni created Mandoverse. I think there's a big question mark on whether or not the Mandalorian and Grogu movie can be the massive hit that Disney and Lucasfilm need. But according to Scooper Daniel RPK, the movie will be the last with no additional movies or new seasons of The Mandalorian. Reportedly, The Mandalorian Season 4 has become The Mandalorian and Grogu movie, and we had reported this before on the show. So according to the rumor, the film will not lead into any new projects. However, there still is plenty of plans for the Mando to appear in the Star Wars universe, just not in his own movies or shows. So the rumor comes, again, from Scooper Daniel RPK via the Star Wars Holocron Fan X account. The Mandalorian and Grogu will reportedly be the last chapter of the series and show, with no future movies or seasons planned. Din Djarin is said to appear in future Star Wars projects after the conclusion of the show. Now, this makes sense to me. We are supposed to be heading towards the culmination of the Dave Filoni Mandoverse, the storytelling that has taken place post Return of the Jedi. So Skeleton Crew takes us a little bit closer to that timeline, whereas the Book of Boba Fett, The Mandalorian, and Ahsoka, we get a little bit further into those decades between Return of the Jedi and The Force Awakens. Also a part of that had been discussed in the past was seeing more of the emergence and creation of the First Order. Perhaps that will be part of The Mandalorian and Grogu. I personally hope so. I want to see more connective tissue. I'd love to see more background with regard to Snoke, the rise of the First Order, as I mentioned. Have no idea whether or not this is going to be the case with The Mandalorian and Grogu. They kind of have a blank slate in terms of what we can expect, considering that The Mandalorian Season 3, wrapped up with The Mandalorian and Grogu, kicking it by a hut without any major threats going on, while we know in the background we have the issue of Thrawn's return. I would not expect to see much of Thrawn in The Mandalorian and Grogu unless The Mandalorian and Grogu film is going to tie directly into Ahsoka and deal with that particular emergence of a new threat. It's just too soon to tell without any other rumors coming around. Now, we do know we're supposed to be getting an Ahsoka Season 2. That's not going to come until much later. And then after that is supposed to be the Dave Filoni Mandoverse culmination film, which my expectation was always going to be that would be a film to wrap up the Thrawn and his return to the regular galaxy that we know from the galaxy that Ahsoka and Sabine are stuck in, and a finale much in the same way that we have typically seen in the past of defeating a massive Empire-type entity, whether it's the original trilogy and the Empire in and of itself, or whether it's the First Order Sith Eternal that we saw in the Rise of Skywalker. So we'll have to wait until we get more information to know for sure. I'm more inclined to believe that The Mandalorian Season 4 is going to be something more akin to a singular separate story with eventually the Mandalorian entering back into the storytelling once we get past Ahsoka Season 2 and in that final Dave Filoni Mandoverse film. I guess another way to describe that Dave Filoni final film will be something akin to Avengers, where we bring in all of the characters, maybe perhaps from the Skeleton Crew, Book of Boba Fett, Mandalorian, and Ahsoka. I'm excited for this era of storytelling. For the most part, I've enjoyed all of these stories, having not seen, I can't comment on the Skeleton Crew yet. And while Book of Boba Fett left something to be desired, mostly because they had to change that character so dramatically, considering that the Mandalorian really did end up becoming what I think most people expected Boba Fett to eventually be. And so the shift to turn Boba Fett into more of this sort of godfather-like gangster figure on Tatooine, it just wasn't something that was up my alley, and I had issues relating to some of the wonky storytelling and just the lack of oomph, for lack of a better way to describe it, in that final episode of what was supposed to be this massive battle taking place on Tatooine. That all just felt kind of flat, apart from some moments. The Book of Boba Fett, I thought, was best served with those additional Mandalorian episodes that took place there in the middle. So, it's hard for me to get too excited over The Mandalorian and Grogu, apart from it's a Star Wars movie that's coming out in the theaters. But that's me and my own fandom desire to have the storytelling that's more aligned with what we've seen in the past of, Jedis and Sith and galaxy threat level storytelling. Now, Daniel RPK also said that the Taika Waititi Star Wars film is on indefinite hold, and there were a couple of different stories that broke this week, rumors that potentially Rey's post-Episode 9 film has been set on the back burner as well. A lot of talk, and again, mostly rumors, but a lot of talk that this was really a push by Kathleen Kennedy to make another Rey movie, but there's so much trepidation from Lucasfilm right now in the wake of the failure of The Acolyte and where the fandom is right now, not to mention that Disney in and of itself has its own issues beyond that, with a lackluster response to the teaser trailer for the new Marvel Thunderbolts film, which, look, I'll go watch it. It looks interesting. But also the fact that Agatha all along, the next live-action Marvel show, is not getting very good reviews either. Needless to say, Disney and Lucasfilm, they need a win, and they can no longer just bank on the Star Wars name anymore to get that win. That's not the case anymore. You can't just make a Star Wars movie. So much of this, by the way, goes back to the fear that Disney has because of what they deem to be the failure of the Solo movie. So many things changed after the Solo movie came out in the middle of all the divisions within the fandom from The Last Jedi, which brings me to the next story on this week's show.
Something inside me has always been there. But now it's awake. And I need help.
And I much prefer be talking about the storytelling and mythology and all of that, but I'm also equally fascinated with the creative process and how and why these shows end up getting canceled and for what reason. Yesterday, I sat down and I watched Star Wars Theory, which is a YouTube channel, embroiled in the middle of the controversy that I'd mentioned on recent shows of a group of other Star Wars content creators that had joined forces and called for YouTube to demonetize platforms for simply giving their opinion of Star Wars shows on Disney Plus. It's one of the most ridiculous things I've ever seen, and it's very indicative of how there is a group of young people that simply do not understand what freedom of speech really means in the United States of America, but that is probably a topic more better served for my Monday through Friday radio show. Star Wars Theory did an interview with Stuart Beattie. He is the original writer of the Kenobi movie, which was supposed to be a trilogy. So I took some notes. I'm going to read to you a brief synopsis from somebody else who also watched this interview and posted on an online forum. Stewart revealed some pretty crazy story beats from the original screenplay, including Kenobi's outlook being a lot different at the beginning, eager to train young Luke at 4 years old. He confirmed a Kenobi vision on Mustafar where he would have been pitted against a young Mark Hamill, and also explained several differences in the Reva storyline and a Commander Cody B-plot. So let me give you the sort of the gist of what Stuart Beattie laid out and what this was. And we saw, and what we got in the Kenobi series was a bit of a hodgepodge of what Stuart Beattie put together. His entry into a Obi-Wan Kenobi movie that he would have made into a trilogy, was based off of one line taken from Return of the Jedi when Luke Skywalker turns himself in on Endor and confronts Darth Vader in that walkway from the walker going in to where the base was, the Imperial base on Endor. Luke and Vader get into this conversation, and Luke is talking to him about coming back, feeling the good in him. You can come back from the dark side to the light side. And there's one line where Darth Vader says, Obi-Wan once thought as you do. And Stuart Beattie says that was never addressed. We didn't see that specifically in Revenge of the Sith. Now, one could extrapolate that perhaps the moment that Vader was referring to was essentially the altercation, confrontation on Mustafar and the battle that took place afterwards, which, results in Obi-Wan having the high ground and lopping off an arm and a couple of legs, and Anakin Skywalker turning into Darth Vader and burning up. He was already Darth Vader at that point, but you know what I mean. So that was the entry into what Stuart Beattie wrote of the Kenobi movie, was Obi-Wan once thought as you do. So what was he referring to? And so he wanted to tell a story of a Kenobi who felt and carried this tremendous amount of guilt for what had happened to Anakin Skywalker, not knowing that Darth Vader was actually alive and that Darth Vader was Anakin Skywalker, much in the same way that we found out in the television show. And there's a lot of little beats that kind of align with what the television show was. And while Star Wars Theory was very blown away by what could have been while Stuart Beattie was explaining this, and I certainly understand why he was reacting the way that he was, but at the same time, I think if you had somebody simply describing to you certain events that took place in the Obi-Wan Kenobi television series, you might have had the same response. It really comes back all in the execution. I personally was really excited for the Kenobi series and just thought that it was the execution where it failed miserably. So you have Obi-Wan Kenobi feeling this tremendous amount of guilt for what had taken place, almost as if the rise of the Empire, Anakin Skywalker dying, didn't know that he was Vader, was all his fault because he failed. But Luke was the hope. Luke was the only hope. So he was going to sit and wait until Luke was 4 years old, because that was the standard time of which you begin training Padawans. And at that time, he would go to Owen and Beru. He would get Luke. He would begin their training. The two of them would train together till Luke was at an age when they could both go and defeat the Empire. He was going to go and atone for what he had done by protecting Luke and then training him to be the new hope. Unfortunately, it turns out Kenobi realizes he's lost his own Force ability. He can no longer tap into the Force. And there would be scenes that would be showing Obi-Wan Kenobi attempting to go and use the Force, and he simply can't. And it's interesting how there's little echoes, not just in the Kenobi series, but in other shows. We saw a moment in The Acolyte, when she couldn't, she attempted to use the Force after taken prisoner by the High Republic, and she can't use the Force. I just thought that was rather interesting. Now, Commander Cody plays a key role in this. Commander Cody feels also a tremendous amount of guilt for trying to kill Kenobi. Ends up having his chip removed, like what we saw in the Clone Wars of the other clone troopers. And of course, Commander Cody, for those that may not top of mind of who he is, he would be the clone trooper who was on Utapau that Obi-Wan saw right as Order 66 was put into play, and has the cannon fire on Obi-Wan. And he falls into the water there. So Commander Cody, of course, he has a pretty big role in the Clone Wars series as well. So the Empire is spreading across the galaxy and arrives on Tatooine at a moment when all of this is happening. Apparently, a part of Stuart Beattie's story was that he actually did attempt to work with Luke a few times, and Luke was showing some signs of having sort of leaning into the dark side. There was one particular scene that Stuart described, which was almost beat for beat the same scene that we ended up getting in The Mandalorian Season 2, when we are first introduced to Ahsoka. And Ahsoka is trying to draw the Force out of Grogu, which is also rather interesting because it's almost like what Stewart wrote for Kenobi ended up applying quite a bit to what happened with Grogu, not in terms of the guilt, but Grogu not being able to tap into the Force powers that he had learned before Order 66 took place. But the scene that Stewart mentioned of a 4-year-old Luke being trained by Kenobi was Kenobi holding a ball. And Kenobi telling Luke, hey, grab this ball. Luke goes to reach out. He's like, no, use the Force, get the ball. And he keeps sort of amping up the pressure on a young 4-year-old Luke. Grab the ball, until finally Luke taps into the Force at 4 years old, and the ball just goes flying all over the place. Sort of showing that he is incredibly powerful, but also doesn't have control over this yet. But the Empire is spreading across the galaxy, and when the Empire arrives on Tatooine, Obi-Wan realizes he needs to get out of Dodge, and Commander Cody is left behind on Tatooine with the Empire there to watch over Luke. Kenobi then ends up apparently on a space station somewhere, and Stewart mentioned that we hadn't really ever seen a space port in Star Wars apart from, say, the Death Star. So we thought that was an interesting concept. There, he ends up meeting with a group of individuals who help him reconnect and rediscover the use of the Force. And there's the B-plot happening of Cody and things taking place on Tatooine in regards to Cody and the Empire that are transpiring at this time as well. Apparently, Reva, it was in the film, and I can't remember if she was supposed to be an Inquisitor or just an individual who was working with the Empire, but it sounds like she had very similar story beats to the Reva that we saw as an Inquisitor in the Kenobi series, where she was a former Padawan. She also finds out about Luke, but in the end ends up keeping the secret from Vader and is killed by Vader, thus concealing Luke's location. Vader would have been at the height of his powers and a genuine threat. The writer talked about a scene in which you would absolutely see Vader take out just a group of individuals because he would have been, again, at the height of his powers, so close to the timeline from Revenge of the Sith as well. Also, there is a vision that takes place, as I mentioned earlier, as Obi-Wan Kenobi is on the space station. He has a vision of being on Mustafar where he comes face to face with a young Mark Hamill, and he realizes that he needs to be careful in training Luke because it's not going to be as easy as it was going to be. And that was the gist of, I guess, what the first part of the story was supposed to be. And Stuart Beattie, being the writer of this would-be show, certainly described it better than I did. It sounded incredibly compelling. Again, I don't know if it would have been better than what we got. I certainly felt that the Kenobi storyline would have worked better, of him feeling the guilt for what had taken place. And I don't know if there was supposed to be another confrontation that Kenobi had with Darth Vader, like what we got in the Kenobi show. On a rewatch of that, it just didn't work for me. I'm not saying that I was completely averse to having Obi-Wan Kenobi come face-to-face with Vader before we see them again in A New Hope, but it certainly felt as if the last time that they saw each other was that last time on Mustafar, so it seemed a little bit unnecessary. Now, there are beats in the Kenobi show at the end that I thought were cool. That end battle, I think, could have been done a lot better if the production was better in the Kenobi show, if the music had been better than what they had used. Why Lucasfilm has this aversion to using the standard John Williams music, I'm with so many other commentators, I simply do not understand why they are so reluctant to tap into some of those themes. I thought Ahsoka did a good job in utilizing certain aspects of what John Williams had done before, but the Kenobi show was so far removed from what John Williams had done in the sequel, in the prequel trilogy. It just seemed like such a colossal mistake, and the production value alone on Kenobi just takes me out so many times. If there's a show where it's so abundantly clear that they're using the volume, it is the Kenobi series. So, again, kind of a what if. Don't know if it would have been better, but a lot of that is also probably stemming from my own personal subjective view that I never really needed added stories for Kenobi. I was always satisfied with what we had already received, and I've said many times before that I felt the same way when it came to the original cast and the sequel trilogy. I never really needed or had any desire to be going on adventures again with Han, Luke, and Leia. I had those adventures in the original trilogy, and they were fantastic. Anything else is just sort of extra. And there's something to be said about seeing your heroes get older like that. There's a new phrase that is now being used more often in pop culture to describe films like The Force Awakens or Ghostbusters Afterlife, Terminator, Dark Fate, Alien Romulus. They're calling them legacy sequels, and I kind of dig that. I think you can put Independence Day Resurgence in that category. Blade Runner 2049. These are sequels to franchises that sort of reestablish the universe, even though they may connect directly to the movies that came before it, a decade or more later, and they call these legacy sequels. And there's a lot of pushback on those movies in and of itself. And you could say that The Force Awakens was a legacy sequel, or that the sequel trilogy is a legacy sequel trilogy. I think that's a fair assessment. But I've been fascinated by that terminology now, and how much I actually enjoy so many of these legacy sequels. So just wanted to throw that in there as something I've been wanting to mention on the podcast, and decided to take this opportunity. As always, I'd love to hear from you. TalkShowNerd@gmail.com.
I need someone to show me my place in all this.
All right, just a couple of quick ones from you this week. Friend of the show, Star Wars Santa. I hope you're doing well. Talking about rebuilding the galaxy. I was surprised that the universe wasn't put back the way it was before the change. I was too. Such a good story and a fantastic ending. Ray 2017 writes also about the Lego Star Wars special. Totally agree. This was very surprisingly poignant. Star Wars animation has done it again. Yeah, if you haven't had the opportunity to watch that yet, or maybe you're, not that into the Lego shows, I would definitely encourage you to go check out Rebuilding the Galaxy. It was a lot of fun, as I talked about on last week's episode. All right, before I let you go, of course, My Nerd World, the Star Wars show, is brought to you by the science fiction adventure series EMBARK. I hope that you will go take a moment, head on over to Amazon.com and check out the 7 books in all series available in Kindle Unlimited, Kindle, ebook, paperback, hardcover, and audiobook. Katha's father died 1 year ago. Yesterday, he gave her and fellow pilot Taft the key to saving humanity. They just don't know it yet. That's the tagline for Book 1, when Taft Guardia agrees to help fellow starfighter pilot Katha Morrow investigate a cryptic message from her late aerospace engineer father. They embark on a mission to uncover the truth behind her father's mysterious death and a looming planet-wide and apocalyptic industrial catastrophe. With 2 rival megacorporations on the brink of interstellar war during the global evacuation, Taft and Katha must race to uncover the key to saving humanity and each other from annihilation before it's too late. Treat yourself, a friend, or a family member with science fiction. It is written for adults, but it's completely appropriate for ages 11 plus. I hope you'll take a moment and pick up EMBARK Book 1 today in your preferred format. You like science fiction, you like to read or listen to science fiction, and you want some really cool technology, romance, ton of action, EMBARK is perfect for you. If you love Star Wars, you're going to love EMBARK. Available right now at Amazon.com. Search for EMBARK, EMBARK, and Jon, Jon Justice, and enjoy this action-packed, epic science fiction adventure series. drop me an email, talkshownerd@gmail.com. And thank you so much for checking out this week's episode. I'll talk to you again next week. Until then, I hope wherever you are, you're happy, you're healthy, and you're safe. And I'll talk to you next week. Bye.
The Force will be with you, always.
My Nerd World.